Three important times Herod Antipas appears in the Gospels. We've covered two of those thus far in our teaching. Now we're going to look at the third one of those, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to move on and look at a few other individuals. We've seen him appear, first of all, in the case of John the Baptist. We drew a picture up here for you, geographical outline of Palestine and how far John the Baptist had to travel in coming to rebuke this pagan man for marrying his brother's wife, marrying too closely. And we'll be able to see some more of what that means on our genealogical chart that you'll have here. It's coming around to you'll have in a few moments. We'll look at that later on this morning. That's seen in Luke 3 and in Luke 9. The best accounts in Mark 6. And it's also found in Matthew chapter 14. I mentioned the Luke passages because for these other two occasions here we have to stay in Luke. Other two places where Herod Antipas is found. Second of those places is in Luke 13, verses 31 and 33, where he's referred to as that fox. And we kind of discussed what that means, and we see Jesus' fearless activity and fearless state of mind in the face of the threats that were carried through the Pharisees from Herod Antipas. And then if you'll turn over, and we've already looked at those, if you'll turn over to Luke 23, this chapter, first 12 verses, Luke 23, third time Herod Antipas is found. So we're distinguishing between him and Archelaus. Archelaus is just found. Archelaus was the ethnarch of Idumea, of Judea, of Samaria, and he's just found over in Matthew chapter 2. Herod Antipas is tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And he is the most important of Herod's sons in the gospel narratives. And he's generally the man referred to just by the name Herod, never referred to in the Gospels as Herod Antipas. He's just the man referred to as Herod. So we've had a marriage situation, and we've got the so-called fox situation. That's what we're looking at last time, Herod Antipas the fox. And here's in the trial, the initial stages of the trial of Jesus prior to his crucifixion. And I'm thinking about particularly verses 6 through 12, but we'll probably have to read the first 5 verses, verses 1 through 12, in order to get the significance of all of this. Now, we don't know too much yet about Pontius Pilate because we left Judea in AD 6 with the banishment of Archelaus from his territory, from his ethnarchy, which was a threefold territory of Idumea, of Judea, and of Samaria. And so whenever he finishes his rule from 4 BC to AD 6, then I've said that the Roman prefects take over, Pontius Pilate being one of those. And I said we'd later come back to that date, AD 6, and pick up the story there, and we'll find some more about the prefects or procurators, Pontius Pilate being one of those. So we don't know much about that, but I think what you do know thus far from our slide presentation of the architectural work of Herod the Great, that Caesarea was the capital of Judea, was the Roman capital of Judea, and the Roman prefects were located here, Pontius Pilate being one of those. Of course, we know here in Luke 23 at the trial we're in Jerusalem. So I just told you where Pontius Pilate would be. You already know where Herod Antipas would be. He'd be up in his capital, which was what city? Tiberias. He'd be up in Tiberias, which is his capital city. Neither one, therefore, in Jerusalem. So we'll have to ask ourselves the question here in a moment, what are they doing down in Jerusalem? The whole multitude of them, of the people, rose and led him to Pilate. Now, they don't mean all the way to Caesarea. They mean right in Jerusalem, because he's in Jerusalem at this time. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar." And we looked at that tribute question before. Now, that's a bold-faced lie there. He did not forbid. He just said, "Render unto Caesar those that are his, and unto God those things that are his." Amen. Saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And he never really said that, not to the multitudes anyway. So Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? Remember the play on Christ's kingship as compared to the local one of Herod and the universal one of the emperor in Rome. Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. That's just old King James for basically answering in the affirmative. Then said Pilate to the chief priest and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up people. Now you have to watch this carefully. He stirreth up people. Well, I guess you could say that. He caused a crowd or two to gather around him and caused some of the crowd to go insane, saying that you're insane and you have a demon. He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, that is, all of the territory of the Jews, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now, you see, remember, they've got this problem over in, John chapter 7. All the religious leaders said, search the Scriptures and find out that no prophet, and therefore no Messiah, comes forth out of Nazareth. That's because they are only in tune with the end part of his life, that he was raised in Nazareth, not that he was born in Bethlehem. But at least they know that this is where his ministry began, beginning from Galilee to this place. And look at verse 6. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Antipas' jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. The Passion narrative is fairly familiar with most people in the churches today, but they certainly don't know the technical background to the material here, and therefore it's easy to miscalculate things and become a little confused. So he's asking this man a Galilean, and of course he knows who's reigning up in Galilee. Remember, Herod Antipas is going to rule from 4 BC to AD 39 up in Galilee, so this is toward the end. Well, he's still got a decade to go, over a decade, but toward the end of the reign of Herod Antipas up in Tiberias in Galilee. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him for a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. The chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. Now, let's go back and kind of review some of this material here. See what we can determine now about the Passion narrative concerning what we know about the procuratorship or prefectship and the tetrarchies in Palestine. Now, first of all, it seems from verse 6 that Pilate senses he's been placed in a bad position. We're going to look at a lot of things. There are a lot of things in the Passion narratives. Of course, not in this class, but he's going to get back at these religious leaders with a little remark or two and an act of his later on, and so you can really see their personalities fully developed here. A lot of people just read this like they read anything in the Bible and just see stick men walking around, gray stick men, made out of sticks. You know how you draw a little stick man. They don't have any personality or character to them, so that you're supposed to read and try to determine, well, what did he mean by what he said, because he was a real human being. And look how many different humans we have in church here this morning with different personalities, and if you say something, you might mean something differently by that than someone else. We're not stick men. They weren't stick men back then either. Just because, as some people say, well, that was a pre-scientific era. Well, it wasn't a pre-human era, though. They were still humans back then. And they had some science as well. Amen. But he senses that he's been placed in a bad position here, and it appears, and I don't mean just appears, it's definitely certain, but it appears as though he's trying to escape, get out of the situation of having to deal with this man Jesus, because as soon as he finds out that he's not from the ethnarchy, formerly of Archelaus, of Idumea, Judea, and of Samaria, but rather from Galilee, the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas, and he likes that. He wants to know, is this man a Galilean? As soon as he finds out he's a Galilean, he wants to send him to Herod because it came under Herod's jurisdiction. So why is he placed? Why does he think that he's placed in a bad position here? Well, he just confessed in verse 4, he recognizes no fault in Jesus. He knows there's no fault in him. But B, he hates to let him go because he knows how fanatical the Jews are over religious questions. He knows that the religious Jewish leaders are so fanatical over these questions of messiahship that they might somehow initiate an uprising which might attract the attention of the Roman emperor, which might cost Pilate his prefectship in Caesarea. So you see, he's got to find a way out of this. And we just happen to know all that just because because you know things like that. It's just easy to see here. He's trying to get out of having to deal with the question, is Jesus, what am I going to say about Jesus? Not is he innocent or guilty. He already said that he's innocent in verse 4. And so how can you continue to go through some type of trial situation here where you've already said that the man is acquitted? But chiefly his concern, of course, would be his own skin, his own hide here. That he doesn't want to let the man go, Jesus, just because he formally acquits him here. And, of course, we won't look at that, but we can see in some other study, like in Jesus' life and the end of his life, that technical Roman terminology is used in the proceedings of a court. In a verse like verse 4, I find no fault in this man, which was technically an acquittal, and the case was supposed to be closed. But it's difficult to close a case in Jerusalem at the Passover. We know we're at the Passover, the most important of the feast of the Jews. Whenever they've got one claiming, I am the Messiah, and they're saying this man ought to be put to death. And of course they don't bring this messiahship charge, they bring a kingship charge. To the Romans, Messiah would mean nothing. King would mean something. King would be a big difference. And of course, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar would be large in their minds as well. So he doesn't want the Jewish leaders to start an uprising among the people which would attract the attention of Rome, the Roman emperor, and cost Pontius Pilate his skin. So that's probably what's going on here in verse 6. He's looking for a loophole, and they supply it with the one word Galilee in verse 5. That's kind of like, just bring something else to mind, over in the book of Acts. I'll have to find the chapter. Chapter 22, verses 21 and 22. I just remember teaching you this years ago when we were studying the book of Acts, how one word is the little catchword or catchphrase that turns the people, or here turn Pontius Pilate in another direction. Here in Acts 22, verses 21 and 22, Paul's giving his testimony and said that God had told him, the God of the Jews had told him, I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. Galilee, Gentiles, two words start with a G. And they gave him audience unto this word, whenever he said Gentile. Then they lifted up their voice and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, it's not fit for him to live. That was one word that caused them to do what they said and did. In Luke 23 and verses 5 and 6, it's one word, Galilee. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, so you have to know something about the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas then. He sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. Now that little end phrase to verse 7 proves we're not at Caesarea, we're not at Tiberias or next door to Tiberias. Both of these men are at Jerusalem. We already know that from just general Sunday school knowledge. Who himself also, that is in addition to Pilate, was at Jerusalem at that time. Okay, here's a question that I want to address to you. It's twofold. Why was Herod Antipas at Jerusalem? B, why was Pontius Pilate at Jerusalem? Since we already know from earlier studies where they ought to have been, then why are they at Jerusalem? What about the feast? Herod's not coming down there to get forgiveness of his sins, or Pontius Pilate down there to serve the Lord.
Most of the people in that area would be going to
Okay, so what does that say, though? They just want to have other friends around them? To police it. To police the area. Who? Which one of those? Herod Antipas? Pilate. Okay, why Antipas? What type of political?
Find favor with people.
Find favor with people. Okay, essentially that's correct. Herod Antipas is down there because he wants to gain prestige in the eyes of his subjects. The Jews up in Galilee are fully Jews. Now, some of the people down in Jerusalem don't think so, but the Jews up in Galilee know that they are Jews. And so Herod Antipas wants to win favor in the eyes of the people, and that's why he's making his trip down to Jerusalem at the Passover. Pontius Pilate goes down to keep order. You have the greatest possibility of the largest explosion among the people at the time of one of the 3 annual feasts, and here's one of them, Passover, when so many thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews would have been in Jerusalem. And who is in control of all of this territory? Whoever's prefect. And the prefect, of course, is Pontius Pilate, who's up in Caesarea. So he has to bring down all of his troops with him. Evidently, Herod brings down his own personal bodyguards. We see this from verse 11. Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught. Well, he's not going to travel down there without a whole cohort of soldiers along with him. Probably Jewish men with him. Romans with Pontius Pilate. For 2 different reasons, both of them are down in Jerusalem. Okay, verse 8. There's just a lot to see here. When Herod saw Jesus, now we're not going to get in right now to, well, where was Pontius Pilate whenever he was in Jerusalem? He sent him over to Herod Antipas. And where was Herod Antipas? There are many conflicting hypotheses about that. When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad. Why? Well, he tells us, for he was desirous to see him for a long season. Why? Well, he tells us, because he had heard many things of him. Why? Well, he tells us, because he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him, because that's what he had heard about him, this was a man who worked miracles. Now, this connects itself with an earlier statement in Luke 9 and verse 9, which I told you last week to remember this little statement here because Luke would pick up this train of thought later. Luke 9 and verse 9. Really verses 7 to 9. We just see the phrase in verse 9. Herod heard all that was done by him, verse 7, which is Jesus. And then, of course, Luke goes into telling us the end story to what he had started off telling us back in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20 about Herod Antipas imprisoning John the Baptist. Of course, he doesn't tell us there what happened in Luke 3, 19 to 20. Herod said, John have I beheaded. Now we know what happened. He was beheaded in prison. Of course, Mark 6 and Matthew 14 fill that story out with the story of Philip, Herodias, and Salome. But who is this of whom I hear such things? What things? Verse 7, heard of all that was done by him. He has to be speaking of miracles and signs here. And look at this last phrase, and he desired to see him. Herod Antipas and Tiberius, Jesus ministering in Galilee, he's raised in Galilee, he desires to see him. And then Luke picks up that same train of thought over in Luke 23, verse 8. Herod, when he saw Jesus, was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him. Same phrase that we find over here. For a long season, ever since way back in Luke 9, a long season. Because he had heard many things done of him, and these things were miracles, and he hoped to have some miracle worked before him by Jesus. Now, what did Jesus call Herod Antipas back in Luke 13? A fox. What do we say were 2 different meanings of fox in first century Judaism? What do we mean by it today? Sly, deceitful, deceptive. What's another meaning? Which was probably the meaning in Luke 13. Insignificant, worthless, base individual. That's probably, if you research in rabbinic writings the term fox, whenever it's used, that's generally what it has reference to a fox, in other words, in contrast to a lion. Remember, we said a fox in contrast to a lion, which means something basically insignificant. Okay, that's important to know. You see, everything Luke is tying all of this together. That's important to know because of verse 9 here. Verse 9 with verse 3. Notice Pilate asked him a question in verse 3, and Jesus gave him an answer. In verse 9, Herod asked him many questions, and Jesus answered him nothing. To show him how contemptible he thinks this man is, he doesn't even grace him with giving him a response to his questions. That means he must have thought more indifferently of Pontius Pilate then, because he answers Pontius Pilate in verse 3, in contrast to Herod Antipas. You see how all of this then ties together. Verse 9, then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. He's killed. Why was he holding him in such contempt? Well, he has killed the prophesied chief figure that was to be the harbinger to Christ, and that's John the Baptist, a relative of Jesus. Remember, their mothers were relatives. That makes them relatives of one another. We don't know whether they knew one another as a boy or as a child. Probably not, since they're raised in different areas. But they were closely related spiritually in the thrust and in the purpose of their ministry, Jesus and John the Baptist. And Herod Antipas is the one who has John the Baptist's head cut off. So Jesus holds him in utter contempt and disregard, to the point that he will not even grace him with a spoken word in his presence. The chief priests, I'm into verse 10 now, and scribes stood and vehemently accused him, and Herod with his men of war set him at naught and mocked him. Now Herod's displaying his character here as an insignificant, worthless individual. What did Pontius Pilate do? Pontius Pilate said, I find the man not guilty. Pontius Pilate had more credibility to him as far as his human nature is concerned, his ethics and his morals are concerned. Now he vacillates, of course, because of the Jewish people. He is concerned about his own hide and his own skin. But at least he starts off by saying, I quit the man. The man is innocent. The man is not guilty. Herod, look at him. He's the one setting him at naught, mocking him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe. This is before Pilate and his men go through this. And Pilate basically just succumbs because he's weak, not because he is so amoral and antichrist. Definitely antichrist as Herod Antipas is. Herod Antipas is a worthless individual. We said the best known and probably the worst of the sons of Herod the Great. Well, he and Archelaus probably somewhere together, running neck and neck as being pretty bad. Because remember in Matthew 2, whenever Jesus found out Archelaus was reigning in southern Judea and southern Palestine, then he didn't desire to go there. That is, his parents, but they went up north. Arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. Verse 12 is a curiosity in the gospel narratives. It's impossible to explain with certainty because we're not given enough information. The same day, Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. They were opposed to one another. So it's a big step for Pontius Pilate to be sending Jesus to Herod, although he's not sending him for purposes of reconciliation, but to escape the tight situation of having to continue with the trial before the Jews. Why were they at enmity with one another? Well, one suggestion is found earlier in Luke. In my opinion, it's a very good suggestion because, well, for several reasons. One, we don't have any other suggestion besides this. So it's really the only hypothesis that we have. And two, we have seen how Luke very carefully in his gospel will drop some comment about some man or event or an aspect of some situation early in his gospel and pick it up later on. We've seen two cases of that now. The first case we saw in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, tells us that Herod Antipas imprisoned John the Baptist. Well, what happened to him when he was in prison? We're not told. Until chapter 9 and verse 9, he was beheaded. He picks up that train of thought and develops it further later on. The same verse This is the second case we've looked at thus far, of Luke 9:9, for he was desirous to see him. That's picked up here in Luke 23. He desires to see Jesus. Here we're told that they are at enmity with one another. Then we might guess, well, let's turn earlier in Luke and find out if he gives us a hint why they might be at enmity with one another. Chapter 13 and verse 1. There were present at that season some that told him, that is, told Jesus, of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Now, if they're Galileans, that means they're outside of the control of Pontius Pilate. They're outside of his jurisdiction. They're up in the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. And yet we're told that Pilate had killed some Galileans, Luke 13:1. So it's my suggestion that this could be a clue to understanding that verse over in Luke 23, that maybe Herod Antipas holds something against Pilate, not Pilate against Antipas, but Antipas against Pilate, because Pilate murdered some of his subjects. Now, what all that means and how that all took place, we're really not told. Jesus goes on and gives them a little lesson that just because someone has been killed and you're still alive, or someone has suffered adversity and you haven't, that doesn't make them more of a sinner than you are. He said, I tell you, all of you will perish except you repent. Whether you've fit in this group that's been murdered or suffered trials or haven't. He said in verse 3, I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. So anyway, that's getting really off the beaten path of what we're looking at now, but it's a suggestion as to why we have that reference to them being at enmity against one another. Luke 13:1. Okay, Herod Antipas, we jump over into the book of Acts. We're looking at all the references to the Herodian leaders. The book of Acts, 4th chapter, the 27th verse. Another reference to Herod Antipas. Acts 4:27. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, here he's referred to with his whole name, Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and with the people of Israel were gathered together. You had two groups of people, Jews and Gentiles, and two leaders over them, Pontius Pilate over the Gentiles and Herod over the people of Israel. And so this Herod, of course, is Herod Antipas, the one we just read about in Luke 23. Then in chapter 13 and verse 1, the man is Herod Antipas again. Acts 13:1. There were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, Barnabas all the way down through Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So they've got as a prophet teacher here in the church at Antioch a man who as a young man or as a boy had been brought up with Herod Antipas. And here, notice that he's called Herod the Tetrarch. That's how he is sometimes referred to in Luke. For instance, in Luke 3:1, it's Herod the Tetrarch. Herod the Tetrarch, that's Herod Antipas. And then we have one other reference. Beside all these references that I've already given you, there's one other reference, and that's back in Luke, chapter 8 and verse 3, that may also be best understood as a reference to this Herod, Herod Antipas. Although this identification is not certain, it seems to be the best conclusion. Certain women, talking about those who followed Jesus, which had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom went 7 demons, Luke 8, verse 3, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. Which Herod? Well, I mean, you have 90%, 95% or higher odds we're talking about Herod Antipas, since we're talking about so many women that evidently followed him from Galilee. We know Mary Magdalene, or we're assuming Mary Magdalene was from Magdala, city on the western coast of the Sea of Galilee, and Susanna and many others which ministered unto him of their substance. So it seems like these would be the verses, the only verses that we have that give us a reference to Herod Antipas. Okay, let's return to something I had said way back in the beginning looking at Herod Antipas, and that concerns his first wife. Remember, he gets into trouble by divorcing his first wife and marrying Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Who was the first wife of Herod Antipas? No, that's Herod the Great, Doris. Who's the first wife? You don't know her name, but she was a daughter of someone. It's a little confusing with all of these names here. Daughter of Aretas, I think I heard someone say. Daughter of Aretas the fourth, 2 Corinthians 11:32. 2 Corinthians 11:32 mentions Aretas. He's not called the fourth there, but we know that is the fourth. That's the only one that fits in this time period. Now remember, he divorced the daughter of Aretas the fourth in order to marry Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And I told you also in that message, don't forget that, and you just did. But I told you don't forget that because we're going to return to that later because it'll be important. So here's what's important about that. Her father never forgot what his son-in-law had done to his daughter. Aretas the fourth never forgot what Herod Antipas did to his daughter. So in the year AD 36, he attacked Galilee. Of course, attacking Herod Antipas there. He attacked Galilee and won a large victory in AD 36. And probably, it's estimated, and probably so, it can be calculated this way, that he probably would have overrun the entire territory, overrun Galilee, if the Romans had not stepped in and told him to withdraw and go back to his territory.
For the continued
Galilee, if the Romans had not stepped in and told him to withdraw and go back to his territory. Now, he was king of the Nabateans, we said. King of the Nabateans. Now, the Nabateans were way down south of Judah, south of the Dead Sea. South, southwest, southeast of the Dead Sea, and maybe we could say a little bit east as well of the Dead Sea. So how did he get way up here to Tiberias or way up here to Galilee? Well, he certainly didn't come through Israel. That never would have been allowed. Probably our clue is that verse over in 2 Corinthians 11:32, which I'll turn to and read again for about the fifth time. In Damascus. Now, where's Damascus? That's way up in Syria. It'd be kind of a striking distance, a striking point from Damascus down to Galilee. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas the fourth, the king. So, in some sense, the Nabateans must have controlled this Syrian city of Damascus, since a governor there is a governor under, we're told, under Aretas the fourth, the king. Kept the city of Damascus with a garrison desirous to apprehend the Apostle Paul. So that then seems to indicate that in AD 36, the way that the Nabateans, which were a group of Arabs, under Aretas IV, attacked Herod Antipas, Tiberias, and Galilee, would have been perhaps from the east, we could say northeast, maybe we could say southeast of the Sea of Galilee, anyway, coming from the area of Damascus and attacking the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas in Galilee. As I said, he won a large victory. He did not succeed in killing Herod Antipas, however, but he just about overran the territory, and Rome had to step in and demand that he leave well enough alone. Then a few more things to wrap up his life. The next year, in AD 37, we have a new emperor that comes to the throne in Rome. Who was that? We gave you that long list of emperors. We go through Augustus Caesar, the one when Jesus is born, Tiberius Caesar, whenever Jesus is in his ministry. Who's the next one? Son of Tiberius, Caligula. Generally, he goes by another name, but this is his popular name, Caligula. Caligula, just like it sounds. Caligula. Interesting name for your, I won't say son, for your dog. AD 37, Caligula comes to the throne. Now, whenever a new emperor would come to the throne, the chief thing to do is to go and present your case before the emperor and hope that he reinstates you in your current position. This would be Herod Antipas as tetrarch of Galilee and of Perea. Herodias is the one who urged him. He did not really want to go to Rome, but his wife was the wife of his brother Philip, urged him, compelled him until he finally acquiesced to go to Rome in AD 37 before Caligula in order to secure his position in Palestine. Well, it probably would have been best that he not have made the trip. Whenever he got there and presented his case before Caligula, Caligula favored someone else in his place. We'll find out that it's his nephew, but we'll discuss who his nephew was later on. Another Herod, his nephew Herod, of his uncle Herod. But he has another additional name, just like Herod has another one, Herod Antipas. Caligula favored someone else in AD 37, and so after a period of a year or so, probably AD 39, he was banished to Gaul. He was banished to Gaul. Caligula gave the right to Herodias, since Herodias really was not the wife of Herod Antipas, but the wife of Herod Philip. Caligula gave a choice to Herodias that you can either stay here in Rome, and he liked Herodias. You'll have, a pension here, you'll be taken care of here, or you can go with your husband into banishment. Well, we'd think that Herodias, of course, would pick Rome over her husband. But remember, she had divorced an earlier husband to marry this man after this man had seduced her and caused her to fall in love with him, so she must have really been in love, Herodias, with Herod Antipas, because Herodias decided and chose to remain with her husband, Herod Antipas, the entire time. So she goes into banishment and exile with him, and later he dies, and she dies in Spain in AD 39. Okay. Do you have any questions then about Herod Antipas? Because the material is going to pile and pile and pile up here. You're already getting a little confused with all of these names here, all of these different Herods. And that last message should have been fresh on your mind because it was the most recent one. Think about one that was 4 or 5 or 6 messages ago. Trying to remember who all those figures are back then. So you ought to have a better understanding, an overview, a bird's eye view of who Herod Antipas was, how he fits into the whole gospel narrative account. Okay, if you don't have any questions, we're going to come to another Herod then, another figure. And this man's name is Herod. But he's also called Philip. Oh, but we've already talked about a Herod Philip before. But this is a different Herod Philip. I'm not the one that produced all these children, so you have to blame Herod the Great for that. That's his fault for naming. Should have named one of them Mike or John or Bobby or Billy Sue or something. Give us a differentiation between all these boys and girls, especially the boys. Okay, we're back to Luke 3 and verse 1. We're back to Luke 3, verse 1. This is our most important verse for our studies now. I think starting in the next message it will be Luke 2, verses 1 and 2. But now we're in Luke 3, verses 1 and 2. See how much we know about this verse now. The 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You want to go through that again? What year did he begin his reign? 14. Okay, so you add 15, gives you 29, which Jesus probably was already crucified by then. And here's the beginning of his ministry, so we have a problem there. So we won't deal with that right now, though. Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Now, was he really governor of Judea? He was prefect. Is it okay to call him governor? Yes, it's using a loose sense here. Governor, technically, he's prefect of Judea, and of Samaria, and of Idumea. Herod being tetrarch of Galilee. Which Herod is this? Herod Antipas. And his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Trachonitis. Okay, let's come to this man. His name is Herod Philip. He was probably the mildest, thank the Lord, of Herod the Great's sons. He was a half-brother to Archelaus and Antipas. Because remember, they came through a Samaritan woman named Malthrace, and Herod Philip comes through another wife of Herod the Great, Cleopatra of Jerusalem. Cleopatra of Jerusalem. Now he's called Philip by Luke in Luke 3:1, but he generally was known as Herod Philip. He was not the same Herod Philip as the first husband of Herodias, who also was the son of Herod the Great, but he was the son of Herod the Great by a different mother. So Herod Philip and Herod Philip were half-brothers, same father, different mother. And they both were half-brothers of Archelaus and Antipas. Okay, let's see what we need to do next. We still have several things to do. Let's go to our genealogy now, before we get any more confused. Okay, do you want to thank me for doing this for you?
Yeah.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome. It needed to be done, but I don't know if it helps tremendously, except to see it before you. Okay, genealogy of the Herodian family. Antipater. Who was Antipater? Remember, he was that shadowy figure behind Jewish politics way back with Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, which, of course, you remember thoroughly all about that. Antipater has some children. Phaziel, you remember him? We've mentioned him before. And Herod. Now, we haven't mentioned the other three, 2 sons and a daughter. And they're not important. That's why I haven't mentioned them. And so we don't show any genealogies here except the descendants of Herod. Herod was married to 10 different women. Let's go across the list. Doris, remember that was his first wife that he divorced to marry. Mariamne, who was through her mother Alexandra, the granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, and through her father Alexander was the granddaughter of Aristobulus II. Well, all I gave you there was granddaughter of Hyrcanus. And really you need to know of Hyrcanus II, but I can only put so much on this. Because remember, John Hyrcanus was the most important Hyrcanus, and he goes way back before Hyrcanus II. And it was granddaughter through her mother Alexandra of Hyrcanus II, and granddaughter through her father Alexander of Aristobulus II. Okay, this was the favorite wife of Herod the Great. No doubt about that. He loved this woman very dearly. This was the woman, remember, whenever he had to leave her twice, he told once his uncle and then another a guard, if I don't return, then kill her. Of course, she was not very impressed with that expression of Herod's love. When she dies, he marries another woman, Mariamne. Picked out someone who had the same name. This Mariamne, the next woman on your chart, we're going across from left to right, was a daughter of Simon, just a regular priest in Judea, whom Herod elevated to the high priesthood. Therefore, he was high priest Simon, and that was probably on the end of your Between the Testaments chart. Another wife, Malthrace. We mentioned her, and I just put in parentheses a Samaritan since I keep calling her a Samaritan. The next wife to Cleopatra. She's the one we just mentioned, so this son Philip under Cleopatra would be the Philip of Luke 3 and verse 1. Then we've got wives 7, or 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And 9 and 10 I just gave you. It's numbers 9 and 10. They get less important as we move along. His most important wife was his first Mariamne. That was the one that he loved the most. Produced 4 children through her. So now we're way back over here under the first Mariamne. 4 children under her. Aristobulus, who married a woman named Berenice. Now, that's important because look at the children they produced. That's the most important group of children there. So we could almost say Aristobulus, although he doesn't figure anywhere into the biblical narratives, Aristobulus is almost the most important son of Herod because he goes on to produce some other people like Agrippa the First, Agrippa the Second, that we will see later in the book of Acts, as well as Drusilla as well as Berenice, another Berenice. Okay, so let's go back up though. We're on Aristobulus, the first son here to Herod and Mariamne, who marries a woman named Berenice. Notice the children they produce. Notice the last one to the far right, Herodias. That's the Herodias of the Gospels. I said that she was the daughter of Aristobulus, the son of Herod and Mariamne. Okay, then the next individual, Alexander, was married to the daughter of Archelaus. Same Archelaus that we're talking about way over under Malthrace, which we don't need to know too much about because this Alexander is not important. And neither are the next two children. We can skip over them. They're not important. So we come to the next wife, the second Mariamne, daughter of Simon the priest, who became high priest. And here under this woman, Mariamne the second, we could say, she produced Herod Philip, but this was the private citizen Herod Philip, who was first married to Herodias. That was the first husband of Herodias, where she divorced him and later marries Herod Antipas. He's the one mentioned over in the case of her marriage, like in Matthew 14, in Mark 6, and in Luke 3. He's simply called Philip there. But that's not the Philip of Luke 3:1. That's a different Philip. Okay, then we come to Malthrace. Malthrace produces Antipas. He's Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, married first of all to the daughter of Aretas the fourth, to be more correct, and then married, after he divorced her, married to Herodias, which first of all was the daughter of his half-brother Aristobulus, which made her his niece, and then she was married to another half-brother of his, Herod Philip, produced through Mariamne, the daughter of Simon, which made her his sister-in-law. And then she marries her uncle for the second time, because if you're the daughter of Aristobulus and Berenice, then you married Herod Philip, then you married Herod Antipas, you married two of your uncles then. You understand all of that. Okay, then Archelaus. He's the important Archelaus, full brother of Antipas, and ethnarch of Idumea, of Judea and of Samaria. And then we skip over Olympias. We come over now to Cleopatra. And we skip over the Herod here. Another Herod, by the way, but thankfully not an important one. And we come to Philip. Philip of Cleopatra. This is Philip the Tetrarch. Herod Philip the Tetrarch. Now, Herod Philip under Mariamne II, the second Mariamne wife, was the private citizen. He was one of the sons, one of the few sons not involved in politics. So we have Herod Philip, the private citizen. This is a way to distinguish them. And Herod Philip the Tetrarch. Herod Philip, the private citizen, occurs in Matthew 14, Mark 6, and Luke 3, 19 to 20. Herod Philip, the Tetrarch, appears here in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. And notice who he marries. He marries Salome. And remember, Salome was the girl that danced before that drunken feast, the birthday, and that's the thing that cost John the Baptist his life. And we see her, if you go back over to the second Mariamne, which produces Herod Philip, who marries Herodias, his niece, and then notice way over the far right-hand side of the chart, they produce Salome. And she was a 13-year-old girl at the time of the Gospels of Matthew 14 and Mark chapter 6. And so then she ends up marrying Philip, son of Herod and Cleopatra. Now the other names, the other four names over there to the far right, you've got Salome, Alexander, and those other names. Those will not be important at all. I just give them to you because it kind of completes the chart. We'll use this a lot in the future to keep ourselves straight, but we'll primarily be talking about Aristobulus and Berenice and the children that they've produced. And there you have those mentioned, Herod, Aristobulus, Agrippa I, and Herodias, because those will figure later into New Testament Roman and Jewish history and later into the book of Acts. So are you somewhat, if you're somewhat familiar with that, that's, I guess, all we can ask for. Okay, let's go back to Herod Philip here. So there's a genealogy. Bring that with you from now on until we get through with it. We won't use it every time, like we probably won't use it next few services, but bring it all the time with you anyway. Herod Philip, as you see on your genealogy here, later in his life, Salome, by the way, is not 13 whenever he marries her. Later in his life, he marries Salome, the daughter of Herod Philip and Herodias. Salome was the young girl who danced prior to John the Baptist's death. Herod Philip, well, before I do that, let's see if we can kind of just rehearse the dates of the others. What would be the dates for the rule of Herod the Great? Just in your mind, the dates for the rule of Herod the Great. 40 or 37 to 4 BC. 40, he gets the title of king. 37, he puts it into practice by subduing Palestine. So 40 or 37 to 4 BC. What about Archelaus when he rules? 4 BC to 6 AD. What about Herod Antipas? 39. Herod Antipas, well, they'd start at the same time, 4 BC. Whenever Herod the Great dies, his sons would start. 4 BC to AD 39. Long reign. Herod Philip reigned from 4 BC to AD 34. He reigned from 4 BC to AD 34.